Have you ever had that horrible penny drop feeling when you realize something awful? Maybe you thought something was one way and then suddenly realize it's the other. That can be from thinking that you had a meeting in 2 days' time and realizing it's today and you're going to be late, and that horrible sinking feeling and how your brain scrambles, to something way more severe, like thinking you're going to get help in the healthcare system and suddenly realizing it's not coming. Chances are, if you have any kind of illness or you've experienced an injury or trauma, you'll be very, very familiar with this experience. And this phrase, the rug being pulled from under you, is one that really stuck with me from my conversation with Melissa Kramer from Live UTI Free and Dr. Laura Katz, a rehabilitation psychologist in Canada. Melissa was talking about the process of getting repeated UTIs, trying to get to the bottom of it, going through the testing routes, being told tests are normal, there's nothing that needs to be done, and going from feeling like if there's an issue with my health, I can get some kind of support and find a way of alleviating these symptoms and ultimately being cured, to having this realization that, oh, I'm not going to be helped with this. I'm on my own to deal with this. And this is a phenomena that I often talk about in therapy with people. And I talk about in It's All in Your Body, which is what I refer to as a belief flip moment. So a belief flip moment is where you thought things were one way and you generally were not too concerned with that assumption because it was working for you and you had a parameter of reality based on that. So the example here is, if I have some kind of an ailment, I can go to the healthcare system and it will be resolved. Only to then have an experience which then flips that. And that flip of the belief has so many wide-reaching repercussions. Going from this sense of I can be helped to I'm not going to be helped means going from a sense of general safety to a sense of general threat. Going from a sense of I can trust others to care for me to I'm completely on my own with this. Going from there's choices and options that I have to I'm potentially going to be trapped with this forever. And as these things change and your assumptions have to update, your brain inevitably goes into threat scramble mode. It's thinking, if this has changed, then what else has changed? What else did I rely on believing that actually no longer applies? And it can consequently update lots of different things. We can go from believing that people around us are generally benevolent, supportive, they're in a crisis, to no one's going to believe me when I talk about my symptoms, nobody's going to step up and help me. And if you think about what that does for your broad emotional well-being, for how you then end up seeing the world, for what you then feel able to do and what actually feels worthwhile to do, that potentially has catastrophic repercussions. You can go from being actively engaged in the healthcare system to trying to find answers, advocating for yourself, to then going to withdraw and feel like there's absolutely no point. And you can imagine the difference that that has on your trajectory when you're navigating health issues. None of that being your fault. It's just your brain's updating of, well, what's the point? And who can blame your brain for that when you are going through this momentous shift of, I thought I would be helped, to I'm not getting any help. What we were exploring in this episode was, what is the role of thinking, attention, and thought processes in the experience of bladder and pelvic conditions? You can imagine that having had your beliefs flipped of I can be helped and people will support me and believe me, to quite the opposite, how that then will influence your experience of someone talking or exploring the role of thoughts in your bladder or pelvic condition. It's much more likely to be perceived as someone saying, your symptoms are all in your head, you're thinking wrong, this is something that you're doing wrong, as opposed to the actual reality of how thoughts should be considered in these conditions, which is it naturally plays a role, but it doesn't mean it's all on you, and it doesn't mean that your symptoms are being caused by your thoughts. But when the brain is threatened and when it's having the momentous task of trying to update its new sense of reality, naturally, to preserve its resources, it reduces things down. So I'll be helped, I won't be helped. This is all biological, this is all psychological. This is something that I can do something about, and therefore it's all on me, or this is something that I can't do something about, and therefore it's all on the doctors. Our brain just doesn't have much space for nuance when it's completely threatened. And so one of the things that I really loved about this conversation with Melissa and Laura was bringing some of that nuance in when we're exploring what is the role of thinking, attentional processes, and these physical experiences. And so integral to that exploration was Laura's specification that thoughts are not just these little fluffy things that happen. They're not incidental and non-consequential. They're not ethereal. They are things that are biologically mediated. When we have a thought, there are brain processes that are happening, synapses that are activating, firing messages from one to another in order for messages to be then transferred, for us to have that experience of having a thought. But the thought isn't just our experience of thinking, oh my gosh, X, Y, and Z. It also has downstream effects to what happens in the rest of our body. And when Laura explained in this episode a bit about the neurobiology of thoughts, I thought it was really helpful to grasp that thoughts naturally are going to have an impact on what else is happening psychobiologically and biologically in your body. If we recognize that there's synaptic activity, and that would make sense that synaptic activity in one part of the body might well have downstream effects on other parts of the body, especially when we're recognizing how integrated the body actually is. So thoughts are not separate from the body, they are integral to how the nervous system's working. And the nervous system orchestrates so many processes in our body, it makes complete sense that to have a thought or some kind of cognitive process that we may or may not be aware of will transmit to how other areas of our body are working. And so I wanted to address something here because this is something that often comes up in my clinical practice, which is this idea that if I'm having a thought which has an impact on my physiology, then it's my fault. We need to detach the ownership from our thoughts. And this is something that we really talk about in conditions like obsessive compulsive disorder, where people will have intrusive thoughts that will cause a lot of distress. One of the key bits of information that we have to convey and explore in lots of different ways is we are not in control of the thoughts that we have. We are to some degree. I can decide that I want to think about something in particular and maybe direct my thoughts, but even you will understand how difficult that can be when you think that you want to think about something, but your brain goes off on different tangents. We don't have ultimate control. And that is, one instance of me deciding to think something, but there's the majority of the day when I'm not deciding. The thoughts are just whirring and they're coming up, and something will come into my consciousness and I'll remember something, or I'll think I'll have to action something, or I'll just get a random song come into my head. This is the nature of our brains, right? We have thoughts circulating all of the time. You might have heard the statistic that we have between 50,000 and 70,000 thoughts a day. When I was doing research for It's All in Your Body, I actually tried to find the reference for that and I couldn't find it. The closest that I could find was a reference identifying that there are these things called thought worms, and we can identify that we have about 6,200 thoughts a day, which is still a monumental amount of thinking per day. We can't be in control of actively generating all of those thoughts. They're popping in. So one thing that I make a distinction about in clinical practice is there's different kinds of thoughts. There's the intentional thinking, which is called cognitive one type processing, where we're directing our thoughts and we have some kind of a goal in our thinking, and they're very conscious thoughts and probably more able to be verbally expressed therefore. And then there's the more subconscious thinking, which is happening just below the surface, or maybe way below the surface. So if I was going to make a cup of tea and everything was where I expected it to be, I wouldn't necessarily be having to have many conscious thought processes. I would just be engaging in it. But if I then found that the tea that I was looking for wasn't there, and I had to then engage my brain to think, where is that tea? Why isn't it there? Then I would switch into more conscious thought processes. But before that, I wasn't thinking about what the tea bags look like, if they're in the right place, etc., etc. That's just happening. But that is a whole lot of thinking that's happening without my conscious interference. So if we recognize that, we can recognize that thoughts about our symptoms, what's going to happen with them, how people are going to receive us when we have them, all of the many, many different types of thoughts that we can have around symptoms, we're not actively deciding to think that. They're being generated because our brain's this calculation machine. And it's especially in overdrive when we're feeling threatened and we feel like there's going to be some kind of adverse outcome. It is true that those thoughts can have a direct effect on how our nervous system processes, how our nerves respond, what happens with our fluctuations of different neurochemicals. But it's important that we recognize we haven't caused that on purpose. We can't take blame for that. That's just our brain doing what it's doing. But it doesn't mean that just because we're not to blame for it, we don't have any role in potentially interrupting it. So it's kind of win-win potentially. We can think about this in terms of habits that you might have that have automatically accrued. You've not intentionally designed these habits. They've just manifested through different experiences that you've had, what direction your brain's steering you towards. Let's take a habit like being on your phone before bedtime. This might have happened because naturally you're looking for some kind of entertainment or interesting thing before you go to sleep as a means of relaxing. Happens naturally. You're not necessarily intentionally deciding, I'm going to do this. And it can be quite okay for you to do. Maybe you drop off to sleep and it doesn't affect your sleep at all. But at some point, maybe you recognize that you're starting to have sleeping difficulties and that you're waking up feeling groggy. And at that point, perhaps you get alerted to the fact that your phone use before bed isn't helping you very much. Just by knowing that, it's not going to necessarily be enough for you to change that habit. You're probably going to have to recognize, oh, I'm doing that thing again. I've got my phone in here. You're probably going to have to take multiple steps to make it harder for you to use your phone before bedtime before you start to interrupt that habit. So if we imagine thinking processes and where our attention's being directed, much like habits, we're not deciding it, it's happening automatically. And there are thinking and cognitive habits we can have that don't serve us. It's not a reflection of us doing something bad, being weak or failing. It's not a reflection on that being the only thing that's informing the outcome of what's happening, i.e. what our pelvic pain is doing or what our bladder symptoms are doing, but it could make a difference. And so once we become aware of that, we can take little steps to try and interrupt particular cognitive processes that might be playing a role. So there's things to gain from recognizing that and working with that, but we have to leave any self-blame and pressure behind because that only makes it harder to interrupt these cognitive habits. And that can be quite difficult to find that right balance. But we have lots of resources in the show notes to help you with that too. Another element that I thought was really important in our conversation was this discussion of the term pain catastrophizing. So pain catastrophizing is a validated construct measured by a questionnaire. There's actually probably more than one questionnaire that I'm aware of that's been validated to measure this construct. And what we were reflecting on was how blaming implicitly the word catastrophizing can be. So this measure was developed to identify what are the cognitive processes that come up when people experience pain. And the questionnaire measures things like, this pain's going to get much worse, I'm not going to be able to cope, and all of the negative predictions that one might have when you're in pain, which come up quite naturally. The term catastrophizing is used also in therapies like cognitive behavioral therapy to identify this thought process of identifying what's happening now and predicting much worse future outcomes. And so I think the best way to think about catastrophizing is that it is a cognitive process where our brain projects forward in a negative way. This is not something, again, that you're actively deciding to do. This is, if you think about it like a mental habit, your brain's taking what it is experiencing now and threat forecasting of what's to come. But the problem is, colloquially, when we use that word catastrophizing, it often comes with this kind of judgment. You're over-exaggerating, you're being dramatic, that kind of edge and element to it, which then inherently builds more sense of self-ownership and blame for something that your brain's engaging it with. And one of the points that was made by both Melissa and Laura is actually what this measure of pain catastrophizing does is it identifies natural fear to pain. Fear when you have pain is very natural. And it's just really quantifying how much of that fear comes up cognitively when you're in pain. So it's not a measure of something that you're doing wrong. It's a measure of cognitive processes that naturally arise when you're in pain. One of the elements of this measure that we see in the research is that it is predictive of future pain, which makes a lot of sense because as your brain's engaging with that projected fear of what might come based on where you are now, we know that the brain is a calculating predictive machine. So we know that some of those thinking processes can add layers that might well influence then later pain outcome. That doesn't mean you're completely producing the pain yourself. You're in pain now for probably a range of different reasons, and your brain's using that data to work out what's likely to come. But what we know is the more the brain engages in that cognitive processing, the more likely it is that you will have increased pain, because that is a particular piece of data that the brain has to work out what you should be experiencing. So again, it's not something that you deserve any blame for. It's not something that you're doing wrong. But it is a process that we can work to target to try and take that layer off the pain experience. And so hopefully in that conversation, there was a lot of clarification around that, especially where people often feel like they're being told, you're creating this. This is the making of your own thought process. That's absolutely not accurate. One of the reasons these conversations I think are so important was another element that came up with Melissa and Laura around perfectionism and how that breeds self-blame. Melissa shared her own experience of being in this kind of hypervigilant tracking spiral where she was trying to do absolutely everything right, monitoring symptoms, being on the right diets, doing the right protocols with supplements, medications, and not feeling like anything was shifting. And again, this is something that I see an awful lot. It is so understandable that you try and throw yourself into everything when you're going through some kind of adversity and you're physically suffering. But that pressure to get everything right, to exert as much control as you can actually cause so much disequilibrium in your body. And it perpetuates this sense that it's all on you, that you need to do everything right. Otherwise, things are going to turn out terribly. And that's a really scary and precarious place to be. It was really helpful, I thought, to listen to Melissa's own experience of allowing herself to step back from that, from to be able to put some things down and not try and exert so much control. And from that more spacious place, she was able to work with herself to identify what actually was helpful to her and release some of the pressure of feeling the need to fix everything. Another thing Melissa reflected on about why this perfectionist push to do everything absolutely correctly is so important was because when she was doing that, trying to get everything right and then experiencing a UTI flare-up, what she noticed would end up happening was this explosion of self-blame, of feeling like she was failing, and this huge increase in self-criticism, which had a massive impact on mood, which had an impact on then what she was doing, how she was feeling. And ultimately, we know those things also have a massive impact on, of course, our quality of life, but also then, what our bodily systems are doing and how able or unable they are to recover from infections or to process pain in particular ways. And so it was a really helpful part of the discussion to recognize the element that can play when navigating these sorts of symptoms. The last bit that really stuck with me from this conversation was around what Laura was saying in terms of when somebody has been so dismissed and invalidated, when there's been so much messaging around this is all in your head or this is a stress or anxiety problem, you can't ask them to engage with the role of psychological or psychosocial elements that might be having an impact on their condition without first giving them complete validation that what they're experiencing is real, of reinforcing why they should be able to still trust themselves and their own body, and that you also trust them and their body. This, I think, is where things often go wrong. When people are referred to my practice, it's often by physicians, doctors, specialists, GPs. And if the referral comes when the doctor hasn't provided that validation, isn't committed to still providing that continuity of care from the biomedical side of things and is essentially saying you need to go and see a psychologist, there will be so much more resistance, or somebody just quite frankly won't engage in psychology because it feels like they're being fobbed off. And actually, quite right in that in that feeling and experience. So what Laura was saying with such clarity there was that validation needs to be there, not just in words, but in practice. It shouldn't be that it's psychology or biology. It shouldn't be that it's a psychologist support or a physician support. Ideally, these things should come together, and that provides the most validation. And that is most reflective of what we're talking about here, the biopsychosocial influences on these sorts of symptoms. You still need to engage with medical treatment or, physical intervention often, whilst engaging with other elements that might also help your recovery or your symptom processing or whatever treatment aims that you have. When you feel comfortable that you're believed and that you can trust your body and the signals that you're getting from it, then you have more ability to be curious about the other elements of things that might be having a role in what you're experiencing. And from that curiosity, other avenues can open up. But if that curiosity is completely absent because you feel fundamentally disbelieved and unseen, it will never feel safe to explore that side of things. And I totally understand that. What I'll finish with was the idea that Melissa shared of this forward motion. You don't need to have everything figured out. You don't need to unequivocally know that if you do this, this will change. But you do have to have some sense of choice and avenues for exploration, and having some plan in place for you to explore what happens when you engage in certain things, can monitor the impact of you doing certain things, can give yourself space and time to explore in that way. That is enough to start giving you a sense of hope and giving you a sense that things can change. And usually when you relinquish some of that sense of I need to work everything out and just start engaging in that forward motion, you'd be surprised at how many things can change. That often involves taking a lot of pressure off yourself, which is not intuitive or easy, particularly when you're navigating things in a system and a society that tends to point the finger back at you. So that in itself can be a challenge, but that might also be its first step of how can I take the pressure off myself and let go of what I can't control and work on what I can. And just even making that separation and having that clarity can make it a little bit easier and less sludgy as you try and navigate from where you are to where you want to be. As ever, I've got some resources in the show notes to help you with some of these concepts that I've discussed today. And if you are enjoying this podcast, please do think about rating and reviewing it and sending it to people that you think might be interested too. Take care of yourself. I'll see you back here soon.
Learned something today? Your brain hasn't finished with it yet. Research shows revisiting new information is all it takes for your brain to start connecting the dots on its own. So subscribe, listen again, and let it do its thing. Thanks again to our partners at Convatec Continence Care. Don't forget to check out the resources and references linked in the show notes. If you found this episode helpful, please consider rating and reviewing the podcast. It really helps to connect the podcast with those who will benefit most from it. This podcast was produced by Maya Sounds and Music.